Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today we're diving into something that I think a lot of people are going to be talking about for quite a while. The fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. It's pretty crazy to think about it. A leader who held power for over 2 decades, gone seemingly overnight. And to try and piece it all together, we've gathered a bunch of different sources. We've got eyewitness accounts from people who are actually there on the ground, official statements that are trying to make sense of this whole chaotic situation, reactions from world leaders. And to help us kind of put it all into context, we've got some expert profiles of the key players in this drama.
It's really a moment that historians and political scientists are going to be dissecting for years to come. I think what's most shocking is just the sheer speed of it all, the speed of the collapse. It's really almost unheard of in modern history.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like just yesterday, Assad was firmly in control, meeting with world leaders. And now suddenly there are reports of people celebrating in the streets of Damascus. And no one seems to even know where he is. It all happens so fast.
Exactly. And to really understand how this even happened, we kind of have to rewind a bit and look at the key events that led up to this moment. The fall of Homs, a strategically important city in Syria, is often called the heart of Syria, was a major turning point.
Can you talk a bit more about what made Homs so important strategically speaking?
Sure. So Homs was a crucial transportation hub. It basically connected Damascus to the Alawite stronghold on the coast. When the rebels took control of Homs, it was like cutting off a lifeline for the regime. It disrupted their supply lines and really weakened their ability to defend Damascus.
So it was a logistical nightmare for the regime, but I imagined it was a pretty huge psychological blow as well.
Oh, absolutely. The fall of Homs showed that the rebels had the momentum. It demoralized Assad's forces and emboldened the opposition. And then what happened next? This was quickly followed by the fall of other key cities. Aleppo, Hama, it was like a chain reaction.
It's crazy to think that just a few months ago, Assad was being welcomed back into the Arab League. He was meeting with foreign dignitaries. It seemed like he was actually consolidating power, not losing it.
Yeah, that's what makes it all the more surprising. And to really grasp how sudden this all was, we need to remember that Assad was really dependent on support from Russia and Hezbollah. But with Russia tied up in the war in Ukraine and Hezbollah taking losses in their conflict with Israel, Assad's external support was dwindling.
So the rug was pulled out from under him. And at the same time, you've got this rebel offensive gaining momentum led by a group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
Right. And to understand how they were able to overwhelm the regime's defenses, we need to look a bit closer at how Assad's military was structured, particularly the units that were in charge of protecting him personally.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. You're talking about the Republican Guard, the 4th Armored Division, right? Can you explain what these groups were all about? I think a lot of people listening might not be military experts.
You're right. It can get a bit confusing. The Republican Guard, which was commanded by Assad's own brother, Mar, was considered the most loyal and best-equipped force. Their main job was to protect Damascus and other key government buildings. Then you have the 4th Armored Division, also under Mar's control. These guys were known for their brutal tactics and their role in crushing any dissent. And then you have the Special Forces highly trained units used for quick responses and sensitive operations.
So basically the elite forces protecting the regime. But even they seem to have crumbled pretty quickly when the rebels advanced.
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest questions we still need to figure out. There are reports of defections from these units, rumors of internal power struggles, and just a general sense of chaos as the rebels closed in. It seems like their loyalty wasn't as strong as everyone thought it was.
And while all this is happening, you've got the people of Damascus taking to the streets. There are all these incredible stories of people celebrating, chanting for freedom. There's even this one detail about mosques broadcasting takbirs.
Yeah, the takbirs. These are expressions of joy and gratitude in Islamic tradition, often chanted during celebrations or times of victory.
Wow, so hearing those echoing through the city must have been something else. It really paints a picture of a nation throwing off the shackles of oppression.
Oh, absolutely. For years, Syrians lived under a regime that ruthlessly silenced anyone who dared to speak out. So to see them openly celebrating in the streets speaks volumes about the desire for change that was simmering beneath the surface.
But amidst all this celebration, there's this huge question looming over everything. Where is Assad?
Right, that's the million-dollar question right now. There's a lot of speculation, but no one seems to have a definitive answer. Some sources say he's fled the country. Others claim he's still somewhere in Syria, maybe holed up in a loyalist stronghold. The uncertainty just adds another layer of complexity to this already chaotic situation.
So you have a power vacuum. These rebel groups, led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, are now in control, and no one knows where the president is. This is a lot to process.
It is, and it raises some pretty big questions about what happens next. What does this all mean for the future of Syria?
Yeah, and that's exactly what we'll be diving into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll take a closer look at Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, their goals for Syria, and how the international community is reacting to this dramatic shift in power.
So we left off with a huge question mark hanging over everything who's going to step into this power vacuum in Syria. And it sounds like this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they're right at the center of it all. What can you tell us about them?
Well, just their name itself, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. It means Organization for the Liberation of the Levant. So that kind of gives you a hint about their ambitions, right? They've come out of this whole chaotic Syrian civil war. They started out with some connections to al-Qaeda, but now they're saying they're more focused on bringing down the Assad regime.
You say they claim to be more pragmatic now. Is there a reason to doubt that? I mean, should we be taking their word for it? Well, there's definitely a reason to be a bit cautious. I mean, their track record raises some serious red flags about their commitment to human rights and democratic values. They have a history of abuses suppressing anyone who disagrees with them and imposing very strict Islamic law in the areas they've controlled.
So it sounds like they're just replacing one form of authoritarianism with another?
Yeah, that's a concern a lot of people have. And their whole vision for Syria seems to be building an Islamic state based on Sharia law. But exactly what that would look like in practice, well, that's still a bit of a mystery.
Right, because you have to look at their actions, not just their words. And their past actions don't really line up with their recent statements about keeping things stable and cooperating with the new government.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what their real end game is here.
Absolutely. And all this uncertainty has the international community kind of on edge. Everyone's trying to figure out how to respond to this whole power shift.
Speaking of the international community, we talked about Russia and Hezbollah losing their grip on things.
Yeah.
What about other countries with a stake in the region? How are they reacting to all of this?
Well, it's a mixed bag. Some are cautiously optimistic, others are straight up skeptical. The U.S., for instance, they've voiced concern about things becoming even more unstable and the risk of extremist groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham taking advantage of the situation.
So they're not exactly embracing this new leadership, especially given all the uncertainty about their ideology and whether they'll actually uphold democratic values.
Yeah, they're calling for a political solution and a transition to a government that's more inclusive, but they haven't really committed to any concrete actions yet.
What about Russia? I mean, they were Assad's biggest ally for years. They must have some strong opinions about all this.
Interestingly, Russia's been pretty quiet so far. They've acknowledged the change in leadership, but they haven't really condemned it.
Why do you think that is?
Well, losing their longtime ally in Syria is a huge blow to their influence in the region. It weakens their whole strategic position. They're probably still trying to assess the situation, figure out their next move, and how to protect whatever interests they still have in Syria.
So they're playing it safe, waiting to see how things play out.
Yeah.
What about the other major players in the region?
Well, Turkey, they share a border with Syria, and they've been really concerned about Kurdish groups in the north. So their main focus is on border security and making sure the violence doesn't spill over. They've hinted that they're willing to work with the new leadership, but they're going to be watching very closely to make sure their interests are protected.
So everyone's just looking out for number one.
Pretty much. And then you have Iran. They've poured a lot of resources into backing Assad's regime.
Yeah.
Losing Syria as an ally is a big setback for them. They'll probably try to hold on to whatever influence they have left. But with the Syrian government in such disarray, it's hard to say how much leverage they really have.
They're in a tough spot for sure. What about Saudi Arabia? They've been pretty vocal in their criticism of Assad for years.
Right. Saudi Arabia has been a strong supporter of the Syrian opposition, so they're likely seeing Assad's fall as a good thing. But they're also wary of this power vacuum potentially benefiting their regional rival Iran. Or they might see these Islamist groups rising up and further destabilizing the region.
It seems like everyone's trying to figure out where they stand in this new reality.
Yeah.
And the stakes are pretty high.
Oh, absolutely. The stakes are incredibly high, and there's no easy answer here.
We've talked about the international implications, the power vacuum, the rise of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. But amidst all this geopolitical strategizing, it's easy to forget about the people at the heart of it all the Syrian people. What are we hearing from them?
Well, it's a real mix of emotions. In the areas that have been freed from the regime's control, there's a lot of euphoria and relief. People are celebrating in the streets, expressing their joy, and finally daring to hope for something better.
Yeah, we saw those incredible images, people dancing, chanting, firing guns in the air, like years of pent-up emotion just pouring out.
Exactly. But we also have to remember that's just one side of the story. There are a lot of Syrians who are terrified, unsure about what the future holds. They've only ever known life under Assad's rule.
It must be completely disorienting for them, this sudden collapse of everything they've ever known.
It is. And then there are those who've been directly impacted by the fighting itself. We can't forget about the millions of Syrians who have been forced from their homes. They're living in refugee camps or barely surviving in cities that have been ravaged by war. The humanitarian crisis is just enormous.
It's hard to grasp just how much suffering they've endured.
Yeah.
Their lives have been turned upside down.
It really is. And even with the regime gone, the humanitarian situation is still a major problem. Getting help to those who need it, providing food, water, shelter, medical care, it's a massive challenge. Aid organizations are working around the clock, but the needs are just overwhelming.
So even as we're talking about these political shifts and power struggles, we can't lose sight of the human cost of this conflict.
You're absolutely right. The human cost is immeasurable. And as we think about the future of Syria, we have to remember the need for healing, reconciliation, and justice for all those who have suffered so much.
That's a powerful point. So as Syria enters this new chapter, what are some of the biggest challenges they're facing? What are the key questions we should be asking?
Well, one of the most urgent questions is about governance. Who's going to fill the void left by the Assad regime? Will it be Hayat Tahrir al-Sham with their controversial ideology and history of human rights abuses? Or will we see a more inclusive and representative coalition emerge? The Syrian people deserve a government that truly represents them and their aspirations. But getting there, that's going to be a long and difficult road.
It sounds like there are so many potential pitfalls. Is there any reason to be optimistic at this point?
Well, even with all these challenges, I think there's always a reason to hope. The Syrian people have shown incredible resilience throughout years of war and hardship. They have this deep desire for peace, justice, a better future for their country. And it's that spirit, that yearning for a brighter tomorrow that gives me hope.
I really appreciate you saying that. It's a good reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can still shine through. But it's also clear that the Syrian people can't do this alone. What role can the international community play in supporting a peaceful and stable transition in Syria?
That's a crucial question. And I think there are a few things the international community can do. First and foremost, they need to make diplomacy and dialogue a priority. They need to engage with all sides, including this new leadership, and foster a sense of trust and cooperation.
So no more threats or talk of military intervention.
Exactly. The focus needs to be on finding a political solution, on supporting a process of peace and reconciliation that's led by the Syrians themselves. Military intervention has only made things worse in Syria.
That's a great point. What about the humanitarian crisis? We talked about how dire the situation is. How can the international community help alleviate the suffering?
They need to provide consistent and significant financial support to aid agencies that are working directly with people in need. They need to make sure that aid gets to everyone who needs it, regardless of their political affiliations or where they are, and they need to avoid using aid as a bargaining chip.
It should be about helping people, not playing politics.
Exactly. And looking ahead, the international community needs to be prepared to help rebuild Syria, to help create jobs and opportunities for the Syrian people, and to give them a sense of hope for the future. It requires a multifaceted approach: diplomacy, humanitarian aid, and long-term development assistance.
It sounds like a daunting task, but it's clearly essential if Syria is going to have any chance at a brighter future.
Mm-hmm.
But before we wrap things up, I want to get your perspective on one final question, and maybe the biggest one of all. What do you think the future holds for Syria?
Honestly, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's impossible to say for sure. The situation is still so unpredictable. There are so many factors at play, so many different groups with their own agendas. But I think it's important to remember that the future of Syria ultimately lies in the hands of the Syrian people.
That's a powerful thought.
It is. They've shown incredible courage and resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. And in the end, it's their vision for their country that's going to shape what comes next.
Well, that's a great point to reflect on.
Yeah.
As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think it highlights the complexities and the uncertainties that lie ahead for Syria. You know, we've spent all this time talking about what's happened in Syria, like all the details, but I think it's important to step back for a minute and think about the bigger picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ripple effects of this are going to be felt way beyond Syria's borders. It's one of those events that people are going to be talking about and analyzing for years and years.
Absolutely. So here's a question that I've been thinking about a lot. What does the fall of the Assad regime mean for the future of authoritarianism in the Middle East?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, for decades, the Assad family ruled Syria with an iron fist. You know, they were the definition of an authoritarian regime.
Yeah, and they're not alone. Right? There are a lot of regimes in the region that project this image of strength and permanence. It's like they're
Crazy.
untouchable.
Exactly. And for a long time, the Assad regime seemed unshakable too. But now it's gone. It just goes to show that even the most deeply entrenched dictatorships can be vulnerable. It kind of shatters that myth of invincibility and sends a pretty strong message to both the people in power and the people they rule.
It's like a reminder that no matter how powerful a regime might seem, it can still be brought down by the will of the people.
Exactly. And that message is going to be heard loud and clear throughout the region, especially in countries where people are fighting for more freedom and democratic reforms.
So could this be a turning point? Could it spark a wave of democratization across the Middle East?
Well, it's definitely possible, but we have to be realistic too. The road to democracy is rarely easy or straightforward. There are going to be setbacks, power struggles, and unexpected challenges along the way.
Right. I mean, we're seeing that playing out in Syria as we speak. Even though Assad is gone, the future is still full of uncertainty. You've got the power vacuum, the rise of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham with their own authoritarian leanings.
Exactly. And the role of the international community is going to be crucial in shaping what happens next. Will they genuinely support a move towards democracy, or will they prioritize stability over freedom?
It's a question that goes beyond Syria. It's a question we all need to be asking ourselves as global citizens, because the choices we make today, they have consequences. They're going to affect the future of democracy, not just in the Middle East, but around the world.
I couldn't agree more. It really highlights the need for us to stay informed, to think critically, and to hold our leaders accountable for their actions.
Absolutely. But, before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about the human impact of this conflict. We talked about the celebrations, the anxieties.
Yeah.
But can you give us a more tangible sense of what everyday life is like for Syrians right now?
Well, imagine for a moment living in a place where everything familiar, everything you've ever known, suddenly changes. The old power structures are gone. There's a feeling of both liberation and uncertainty. People are cautiously hopeful, but they're also worried about the future, especially with groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham gaining influence.
It sounds like a time of immense upheaval, strange mix of hope and fear.
Exactly. And for many Syrians, their daily lives are still a struggle for survival. Millions are displaced, living in overcrowded camps, struggling to access basic necessities like food, water, and healthcare.
It's hard to imagine what they're going through. Their lives have been torn apart by years of conflict, and now they're trying to rebuild their lives in their country.
And it's a monumental task. And, it's important to remember that behind all the political analysis and the talk about geopolitics, there are real people whose lives have been deeply affected by all of this.
People who have shown incredible strength and resilience in the face of truly unimaginable hardship.
Absolutely. And as we move forward, I think it's crucial that we keep their stories, their hopes, and their dreams in mind.
I think it's a perfect thought to end on. This deep dive has been quite a journey. Right, we started with the shock of Assad's fall, and then we explored the complex realities on the ground, and we grappled with the broader implications for the region and the world.
Yeah, it really has been a journey. And I think it just goes to show how important it is to stay informed, to engage in thoughtful discussions, and to recognize the human cost of conflict and political change.
Well said. And to everyone listening out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this has given you a better understanding of this pivotal moment in history and maybe inspired you to keep learning and stay engaged with what's happening in Syria. As always, keep diving deep.